We begin in the middle of the 21st century, where in some countries democracy seems to falter and rebel with the economy and other political situations. In Australia there is a regular political struggle between right-wing conservative nationalists, NPA, and left-wing extremists, CPA. The consequences are that the economy is sinking as a result, inflation is also taking place, and there is a veritable guerrilla war between political extremists and those affected and the wealthy who are economically failing by the booming economic crisis, collapsed infrastructure and political disputes. Some global parts of the world are involved. In Vanuatu, the policy became fascist during Abchil. He wants a strong conservative state. Due to the responsible economic crisis and the political disputes, the legislature is weakened and the far-right NPA, also known as the Sozism party, wins. The political ideology based on this party is called social liberalism. Under President Michael McCormack, Chief is at the helm. In a short time the NPA has eliminated other local parties and groups and is a major force in Australian politics, thus becoming Democratic Australia to the fourth Malo. Their aim of the ideology is to unite Oceania nationally, politically and economically, and to make Australia a great nation with a unified people. Thus minorities like Polynesians, Marxists and Hindus will be annihilated. The country stops the consequences of economic crises and begins service in the military work environment. New Zealand and allied ally France detest Australia, and McCormack sees it as a spur to a military industry in his country. Papua New Guinea is returned to Australia. Vanuatu invades the French-owned archipelago of New Caledonia to curb French deployments and render them incapable of cooperation. Vanuatu is the ally of the Australian Empire. In Micronesia, its policy forms a close relationship policy with the Fourth Malo, also known as the Micronesian Australian Confederation. He is there for economic and political support, and is a symbol of peace. In Asia is another ally of the Fourth Malo, Pakistan, with its allies. Pakistan invades its rival neighbor India. Its allies Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia and Tajikistan are now also pursuing expansionist policies. India is a Hindu nation state and Pakistan sees this as a provocation and declares war on India. In Oceania, the Solomon Islands are peacefully incorporated by the local nationalist party. Australia then takes Papua for the white minority living there. Palau is a satellite state of Malo. Samoa influences and annexes the local sea region of Niue. Samoa is also an ally with Australia. Pakistan captures and destroys Indian cities. Afghanistan is a satellite country of Pakistan. Tajikistan is an ally of Pakistan, and especially Iran. Iraq and Saudi Arabia are closely linked. Saudi Arabia annexes the Gulf states except for its satellite state of Oman. Turkey is also stepping in as an ally in the Middle East. Iraq marches into Jordan, considered the gateway to North Africa, to ally with the Middle East and the Maghreb states located in North Africa. Australia wants to take Tuvalu next. But Tuvalu is a member of the Allies. New Zealand and France threaten the Australian Empire should it take Tuvalu. It uses the blitzkrieg tactics of the Second World War, where it watched as a former Allied force. Thus, Australia attacks Tuvalu and thus declares World War III. In the early morning is shot back. Tuvaluans up and tried to push back the Australian troops. But in no time Tuvalu is occupied. New Zealand and France have hesitated too long, which works in Australia's favour. Neutral Nauru is effectively annexed and the Republic of Kiribati is also occupied by Australia. Australian troops stationed in the city of Bundaberg and some in Vanuatu held New Caledonia can surprise New Zealand from there. When the Australians invaded the North Island of New Zealand, New Zealand troops counterattacked from the south. To ward them off, the Australian troops pushed the New Zealand troops towards the northeast coast, Plenty Bay. The New Zealand army was humbled by this success. The Australian Nationalist Army now occupies the North Island. With the occupation of the capital Wellington, New Zealand and its army is defeated. The South Island is a puppet state of the Australian Empire. Vanuatu occupies New Caledonia, to contain French stationary. Vanuatu and Australia, including Pakistan and its allies, together formed the Axis powers. Since New Zealand is defeated by Australia, the territory in Antarctica claimed by the Malo is militarily reinforced and is officially a politically owned territory of Australia, with no right to autonomy. In parallel with Vanuatuan troops, Australian troops occupy the northern part of the territory in Antarctica from the satellite state of New Zealand. On and near Graham Land of Antarctica, is the territory of the Argentine Republic and the territory of the US, which are recently involved and are also allies. Australian and Vanuatuan troops attack US territory in Antarctica. But these are allied with the Argentine Republic. East Timor becomes a member of the Allies, but is quickly occupied by Australian troops. Now the war of destruction begins in the east. Australian Malo declares war on the Argentine Republic, South American Union. Fiji, which is a separate Axis ally, occupies neighbour Tonga to vouch for its power. The Australian army surprised the South American Union, including the Argentine Republic, with blitzkrieg tactics, including massacres against numerous Latinos and Bolsheviks. The Australian troops want to advance to the Atlantic coast and the Amazon, which among other things leads to economic and geopolitical importance. Because the Amazon basin contains many mineral resources and raw materials, as well as rich flora and fauna. But the South American Union allies itself with Venezuela and the Guyana states, as well as including the USA, in order to prevent the favor of the Australian troops. So far, the Fuerz's armada is not as numerous as the Wehrfire, but superior to the Australians. These are subordinate to them. What the troops of the Wehrfire have so far underestimated because of their equipment are the temperatures in the Andes. They are too inferior for that. In few days, the temperature often reaches below 20 C and more. Wehrfire casualties continue. On the Middle Eastern front, Pakistan, together with its satellite state of Bangladesh, occupies the northern part of India and is attempting to occupy all of the country to the south. Iran occupies Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan. Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, which has its own autonomy, are satellite states. Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are occupied by Iranian troops. Supported by Pakistan, Tajikistan and Iran, Uyghuristan is dependent on its neighbors but has its own autonomy. Iraq, which occupies Jordan and is allied with Saudi Arabia and whose satellite states are Lebanon and Palestine, is advancing towards North Africa. Its allies, Libya, Algeria and Morocco, occupy North Africa. Their target is Bermuda and their Atlantic states of the USA. The turning point and the sign that the US is intervening is the occupation of the Cape Verde Islands, which suggests geopolitical and economic reasons. Pakistan massacres Hindu population in occupied India. In Oceania, in some states, especially in New Caledonia, partisans are forming and resisting. As well as in Polynesia and the occupied areas of the South American and Argentine territories. Partisans are also formed in India. In the Eastern Pacific, in the northeastern Oceania, Australian submarines try to block US-American voyages and American invasion and also want to occupy and invade the USA. As already mentioned, The South American Union cuts off the favorable route for the Australian troops with Venezuela and their Guiana states. In the city of Quito, one of the cauldron battles takes place. In Antarctica, French troops land westward and American troops supported by Argentine troops enter from east. New Zealand uses the favor to resist. However, it is completely occupied by Australian and Vanuatuan troops to secure power. But by the French and the Americans, the Australian army in the Antarctic capitulate rapidly, but still holds out in occupied New Zealand territory in Antarctica. In Cuzco on the Eastern Front, one of the heaviest battles of the Eastern Front takes place. Vanuatuan and Samoan troops leave the crisis area early, leaving the Australian troops alone against the Fuerz's armada. Australian troops are forced to surrender. In Antarctica, the last Axis troops are defeated. The Allies now control the oceanic continent. The first Allied landings in Oceania are in New Caledonia. American, Argentine landing also takes place from New Caledonia in Vanuatu and threatens the country should it not surrender in time. Australians, together with Vanuatuan troops, quickly approach the island states southwards and push the Allies out. But in New Caledonia these unite with the partisans. On the Eastern Front, after the victory over Cuzco, the Battle of Neuquén follows, which results in many losses on both sides. The Australian Army's supplies are just over the limit. Add to that the rare cold of the Andes. The largest landing during the collapse is in the North Island of occupied New Zealand at Plenty Bay. United States, Argentine Republic and some troops from Allied Mexico push back Australian troops. A huge Allied defense ensues in the oceanic continent. In southern New Zealand troops land from Antarctica along with American troops from New Zealand territory who are members of the Allies. The Allies are on Australian soil. Sydney is surrounded by Argentinian troops. The Australian generals commit suicide. Few days before the city falls, Vanuatu loses its autonomous politics. Australia is divided into the occupation zones of the four victorious powers. Papua New Guinea becomes American and then its own politics. On the Middle Eastern Front, Pakistan initially ignored the ultimatum. But then the religious leader officially reveals the surrender. Russia, which also belongs to the Allies, invades occupied Kazakhstan, Uyghuristan and the Central Asian satellite states belonging to Iran. American and French troops arrive from west and south. By surrendering in North Africa, Iraq and Saudi Arabia lose many territories and surrender voluntarily. In the end, Pakistan tries to take action again against India, but the Indian partisans are allied with the Allies and with the French and American troops who have already arrived. Pakistan reluctantly surrenders to the Allies. Pakistan surrenders. The country is divided among the French, Americans, and Russians. Kashmir and Gilgit became Indian. Possible consequences that Australia remains divided in two due to the barbaric actions in Argentina. The American, French and New Zealand zones reunite to form one Australia. However, the Argentine zone remains a satellite state of Argentina. The matter with Kashmir would be settled quickly. Kashmir and Gilgit are now part of India under international law. As a result, Uyghuristan, which previously belonged to China, gained its independence under international law. In Australia, as well as in Oceania, the severe influence of Argentina would be felt in the east, and the democratic and lighter influence of America and France in the west and north. Where New Zealand had its zone would be the old previous democracy in good old Australia.